The night Nora Voss drove back into Caldwell County, the sky was the color of old bruises. She had been on the road for 6 hours straight, her hands tight around the steering wheel of a borrowed pickup truck with a cracked dashboard and a heater that only worked on one side. The fields on either side of the highway were flat and dark, broken up every few miles by the dim glow of a farmhouse or a gas station that looked like it hadn't been updated since 1987. She knew this road. She had driven it hundreds of times as a girl, pressed against the window of her father's old Chevy, watching the fireflies blink in the tall grass. That was a long time ago. She didn't feel like that girl anymore. She felt like something had been hollowed out of her, scooped clean the way you'd scoop seeds from melon, and what was left was just a shell. Functional, moving forward, but empty in a way that no amount of sleep or food or conversation had managed to fix in the past 3 months. 3 months since she had come home from a weekend nursing conference to find the house silent. Not the comfortable kind of silence she was used to. Not the peaceful quiet of a Tuesday evening when her husband Ray was out and her grown children were away at their own lives. A different kind of silence. The kind that has weight to it. The kind that means something is already gone. The furniture was still there. Most of it. But the drawers in the master bedroom had been emptied. Ray's clothes were gone. His golf clubs. The photograph from their wedding day, the one in the oval silver frame that used to sit on the windowsill, had been replaced by a pale rectangle on the paint where the sun hadn't reached. She stood in that bedroom for a long time before she moved. The divorce papers were on the kitchen counter, already drawn up and signed on his side. Her attorney called them comprehensive. Nora called them ambush. Ray had been planning this for at least 8 months, her lawyer estimated based on the asset structuring. While she had been driving to night shifts and picking up overtime and caring for her ailing mother in the back bedroom, Ray had been quietly moving money, redirecting accounts, restructuring the joint investment her father had left her into forms she didn't fully understand. By the time it was over, by the time the court had processed everything and the settlement had been finalized, Ray had a house in Dayton, the newer of the 2 vehicles, and enough of the liquid assets that her attorney called the outcome deeply unfair, but explained that fighting it further would cost more than it would recover. Her 2 children, Marcus, 31, and Jolene, 28, had sided with their father. That was the part that didn't heal. Marcus had called her once during the proceedings, not to check on her, to ask about the investment accounts. Jolene had sent a text message on Nora's birthday that said only, "Hope you're figuring things out." They had taken the house, the car, the bank account, and somewhere in that extraction, they had taken a version of herself she'd spent 30 years building. But they forgot about the farm. Before we go deeper into this story, take a second and hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and let us know where you're watching from. I'm curious to know how far these stories travel. Her father, Dale Voss, had left her 11 acres outside of Caldwell County, a farmhouse that hadn't been properly lived in since 2009, and a weathered red barn that she hadn't stepped foot in since she was 17 years old. Nobody had bothered with it in the divorce proceedings. Ray's attorney had dismissed it as a liability, old property taxes, a structure of uncertain condition, farmland that hadn't been worked in over a decade. According to the paperwork, it was worth almost nothing. But to Nora, as she turned off the highway onto the gravel road that cut through the south field, the headlights sweeping across overgrown grass and the dark silhouette of the old oak tree her father had hung a tire swing from when she was 4 years old. It was the only thing she had left. She stopped the truck at the end of the lane and sat with the engine running for a moment. The farmhouse was dark. The front porch light had burned out years ago, and nobody had replaced it. The paint on the siding was peeling in long strips, and she could see even from here that the gutters on the east side had pulled away from the roofline. One of the upstairs window shutters was hanging at an angle, attached on only one hinge. It looked like everything she felt. She turned off the engine. She got out of the truck. She stood in the dark at the end of her father's lane, breathing in the smell of wet grass and turned earth and something sweet she couldn't name. And for the first time in 3 months, she didn't try to hold anything together. She just let herself feel it. The full scope of it, all of it at once. The grief of the marriage, which she had kept so carefully packed down during the proceedings because she couldn't afford to fall apart when there was fighting to be done. The grief for her children, which was different and sharper and harder to locate, Not the clean grief of loss, but the complicated ache of betrayal from people you spent 30 years protecting. The grief for the version of herself she had believed in. The woman who had built something solid and permanent and good, who had kept the household running through 2 decades of Ray's career pivots and Marcus's adolescent upheavals and Jolene's years of difficulty, who had worked nights and then come home and still found a way to be present, to make dinner, to remember the details of everyone else's lives. The grief for that woman and the painful recognition that what she'd built had been built on ground that wasn't as solid as she believed. She let all of it come. And then, because she was Nora Voss, and she had always been more practical than she was dramatic, she wiped her face on the sleeve of her jacket and picked up her bag. She walked to the front door, found the spare key where her father had always kept it, behind the loose third board on the left side of the porch railing, and went inside. The inside smelled like closed rooms and cedar and something faintly floral, as if her mother's old perfume had soaked permanently into the wallpaper. Nora stood in the front hallway with her duffel bag on the floor and felt the whole weight of the house settle around her. It wasn't an unpleasant feeling. It was the feeling of being recognized. She ran her hand along the wall until she found the light switch. The overhead light in the hallway flickered twice, then held. A single bulb, casting warm yellow light across the hardwood floors, the narrow staircase, the row of hooks by the front door where her father used to hang his cap. The cap was still there. Nora hadn't expected that. She stared at it for a long moment. The faded green canvas, the sweat-stained brim, the embroidered logo of a seed company that had gone out of business sometime in the 90s. She didn't touch it. She wasn't ready for that yet. She moved through the house slowly, like she was taking inventory of something more than furniture and walls. The kitchen still had the same yellow tile countertops her mother had chosen in 1978 and always meant to replace. Her mother used to say every spring that she was going to redo the kitchen. New tile, maybe light blue this time, or white, and every spring something else needed doing first. And eventually the yellow tile became part of the story of the house, permanent not by design, but by the accumulation of deferred intentions. Nora ran her hand over them now. The grout had darkened over the years, but the tiles themselves were intact, vivid and cheerful in an old-fashioned way, and she surprised herself by finding them beautiful. The living room had the same oak floors her father had sanded and refinished the summer she turned 12, the two of them working side by side on their hands and knees while her mother sat on the porch and read mystery novels and periodically brought them lemonade. Her father had been particular about those floors. He believed that a floor you could see your reflection in was a floor with self-respect. Nora couldn't see her reflection in them now. 15 years of dust had seen to that, but the wood itself was still sound, still holding, still carrying the grain and warmth her father had spent a summer revealing. The back bedroom where her mother had spent her last 2 years still had the hospital bed that had been too difficult to dismantle and remove, pushed against the far wall like an artifact of a chapter that had closed. Nora stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at it. She felt the usual complicated feelings that came with this room, the love and the grief and the exhaustion that had layered over each other during those years of caregiving. The final months when her mother had slept more than she woke and Nora had sat in the chair by the window and listened to her breathe and understood that this was the most important work she would ever do, even as it was the hardest. She closed that door gently and moved on. The upstairs, her old bedroom, still with the faded purple curtains she'd chosen at 14, still with the framed print of mountain peaks her mother had found at a church sale that Nora had always loved for reasons she couldn't articulate, something about the implied distance and the clean air and the suggestion that there were places in the world that existed at an entirely different altitude from the problems of daily life. Her parents' bedroom, cleared now, the furniture gone years ago except for the cedar chest under the window. A bathroom with a clawfoot tub that her father had stubbornly refused to replace because he said there was no reason to fix what wasn't broken. A philosophy she had inherited so completely that she'd never noticed it until now. There was dust on everything. Cobwebs in the upper corners. A dead moth on the kitchen windowsill. But there was also something else. Something that surprised her. Integrity. The house had been empty for 15 years, largely unattended, exposed to Ohio winters and summer heat, and it was still standing. Still sound. The floors didn't give under her weight. The windows, though grimy, were intact. The roof, which she'd expected to find crumbling from the outside, had held. Her father had built things to last, or he'd hired men who did. Either way, the bones were good. She set the duffel bag on the kitchen table, filled a glass of water from the tap. It ran rusty for a moment, then cleared and sat down. She sat there for a very long time in the quiet of her father's kitchen. The refrigerator had been unplugged and left with the door propped open, but the kitchen clock, battery-powered, with a rooster on the face, the kind of clock that appears in farmhouse kitchens across America and never quite goes away, had somehow kept running. It was 6 minutes slow. She had no way of knowing when it had fallen behind, whether it had been running slow for 1 year or 15, but it was still going, still marking the hours in this empty room, and there was something in that she found quietly remarkable. And slowly, something that felt like clarity began to creep in around the edges of the emptiness. She couldn't go back. That was finished, but she was still here. She was in her father's house. She had her nursing license, which nobody could take from her, and she had 11 acres, and she had a house with good bones. She had whatever this place could become if she was willing to work for it. She thought about Ray, moving smoothly through the life he'd restructured around her absence. She thought about Marcus, who had asked about the investment accounts and never once asked if she was okay. She thought about Jolene's text, "Hope you're figuring things out," and the casualness of it, the suggestion that Nora's dissolution was merely an administrative inconvenience. She thought about her father, who had worked this land for 40 years and raised her to believe that the most dangerous thing a person could do was assume that someone else would handle what needed handling. "You deal with it yourself, Nora girl," he used to say, "or it doesn't get dealt with." She went to bed that night on the old sofa in the living room, wrapped in a quilt she found in the hall closet, and slept better than she had in 3 months. The weeks that followed were the hardest kind of hard, the kind that doesn't announce itself dramatically, the kind that just grinds day after day in the unglamorous way that real life tends to move. There's a version of recovery stories, a version that gets told on social media and in inspirational posts, in motivational videos with sweeping music that compresses the hard part into a montage. You see the person struggling, and then you see a pivot, a moment of grace, and then everything accelerates toward triumph. It doesn't feel like that from inside. From inside, the hardest weeks of rebuilding feel like standing at the bottom of a staircase that keeps adding steps. You climb 2 and look up, and there are 4 more where there were 2 before. You don't feel momentum. You feel the effort of each individual step. Nora got a temporary position at the Regional Medical Center 22 miles north. Nights and weekends, the shifts other people didn't want, and spent her days off working on the house. She started with the most urgent repairs: the sagging gutter, the broken shutter, the back porch steps that had rotted enough to be dangerous. She watched YouTube tutorials on her phone while sitting on the kitchen floor drinking coffee and took notes in the margins of a yellow legal pad. She drove to the hardware store in town and bought what she needed and came back and figured it out. She made mistakes. She set the first bracket for the repaired gutter 1/4 inch off and had to pull it and redo it. She chose the wrong weight of wood filler for the porch steps and had to sand it back and start again. She stripped a screw in the shutter hinge and spent 45 frustrating minutes with a rubber band and a screwdriver trying to extract it before she figured out the trick. She didn't find these mistakes discouraging. She found them instructive. There was something clarifying about a problem that had a specific material cause and a specific material solution, something almost soothing about the difference between the problems of this house, which could be diagnosed and addressed and fixed, and the problems of the past year, which could not. She kept notes. What worked, what didn't, what she'd do differently. Her father had been a great keeper of notes, and she had absorbed the habit without realizing it. The people in Caldwell County were cautious at first. Not unfriendly, but cautious. The way small towns are when someone returns after a long absence, especially under circumstances that have a story attached to them. People had heard things. This was not a large community. Dale Voss's daughter had come back to the old farm after some kind of trouble in Dayton, and people speculated in the quiet, careful way that small-town people do in grocery store aisles and church parking lots and over back fences. Nora didn't explain herself. She nodded when nodded to, said good morning when people said good morning, paid her tab at the diner on Route 9 without complaint, and tipped 20% every time because she remembered what it was to work for tips. She wasn't cold, but she wasn't open either. Not yet. She had learned in the previous year what happened when you gave people access before you knew whether they were safe. She was being careful, not suspicious, just careful. The first real conversation she had was with a woman named Beryl Dunmore, who farmed the 60 acres adjacent to the Voss property and who showed up one morning at the end of Nora's lane in a battered green ATV with a covered dish in her lap. "Beef stew," Beryl announced, climbing off the ATV with the authority of a woman who had decided something and was carrying it out. She was in her late 60s, big-boned and weathered, with silver hair cut close and eyes the color of creek water. "I would have brought it sooner, but I figured you needed some quiet first." Nora looked at the covered dish. "Thank you. Your father was a good man," Beryl said, without preamble or apology. "This land belongs to someone who remembers that. I'm glad it's you." She handed over the dish and got back on the ATV and drove away across the field before Nora could formulate a response. Nora stood at the end of the lane holding warm beef stew and felt for the first time something that was not quite grief and not quite relief, but existed somewhere in the complicated territory between them. She ate the stew that evening in the kitchen, and it was very good, and she cried a little while eating it, not from sadness exactly, but from the experience of being considered, of someone deciding she was worth a covered dish brought across a field, which was a smaller kindness than it sounds if you have never been in a season when small kindnesses are the only kind available to you, and therefore the most important ones in the world. Over the following weeks, other things happened. Small things. The kind of things that don't seem significant until you stand back and look at the pattern. The pharmacist in town, who had known her father, quietly adjusted a prescription order so she wouldn't have to drive to the next county. The young deputy sheriff, who had grown up on the road just past the Dunmore farm, stopped his cruiser one afternoon when she was hauling fence posts and helped her unload them without being asked. A woman from the Methodist church brought over canning jars and, along with them, an offer to help if Nora ever wanted to put up vegetables. The mechanic who serviced the truck found a part cheaper than quoted and called to tell her, which a less honest person would not have done. The community was watching, but was also quietly deciding something in her favor. She started working the south field in the evenings after her overnight shifts, still in her scrubs most days, pulling up the invasive brush that had taken over the fence line and turning the soil along the edge where her father had grown sweet corn. Her body ached in ways it hadn't since she was young. Her hands blistered and healed and blistered again. She didn't mind. Physical pain had the advantage of being honest about its source. Inside the house, she was making progress. She had found her father's old journals in the cedar chest in the upstairs bedroom. 20 years of them, written in his cramped, careful hand, documenting the weather and the soil and the crops, and, woven through it all, observations about life that had the quiet authority of a man who had paid attention. She read them in the evenings by the kitchen lamp, learning things about her father she had never known when he was alive. How frightened he'd been the year the drought came, and he didn't know if they'd make it through. How proud he'd been of her. Not in the way she'd expected, not for grades or accomplishments, but for small moments she barely remembered. A time she had stood up for a smaller kid at the county fair. A time she'd sat with a neighbor whose dog had died without being asked. Nora has her mother's heart, he had written in an entry dated from the year Nora was 14. She doesn't know yet how much that matters. Someday she will. She cried for the first time in months reading that. Then she washed her face and went back to work. Before we continue, take a second and share your thoughts so far on Nora's story in the comments below. I read every single one, because what I'm about to tell you next is where things begin to change in ways nobody saw coming. It was Beryl Dunmore who first suggested the idea. They had developed a habit by then. Beryl coming over on Sunday mornings with coffee in a thermos, and the two of them walking the perimeter of the Voss property while Beryl pointed out things Nora hadn't noticed, and Nora asked questions she'd been too proud to ask anyone else. It was a comfortable arrangement. Beryl was not a woman who trafficked in pity, and Nora was not a woman who could tolerate it, and so they had arrived naturally at a dynamic built on competence and mutual respect. "You've got good topsoil in the north field," Beryl said one morning, her boots leaving dark prints in the wet grass. "Your father composted it for years. It's richer than most of what I'm working with on my side." "I know," Nora said. "He wrote about it. The pH levels, the drainage. He tested it every spring." Beryl looked at her sideways. "You've been reading the journals." "All of them." A pause. "He would have liked that." They walked along the fence line for a while without speaking. "There's a farmer's market starting up in the spring," Beryl said eventually. "First one this county's had in a while. The county extension office is trying to bring more small producers into it. Herbs, specialty vegetables, honey. There's a grant available for first-year producers. USDA program for women returning to agriculture. I know the woman who runs the extension office. She's good people." Nora looked across her father's north field, dormant now under the November sky. 11 acres. Good topsoil. A barn full of her father's old equipment, some of which she'd begun to inventory and found in surprisingly workable condition. "I'm a nurse," she said. "You're also a Voss," Beryl replied. "And the Vosses have always known how to work this land." Nora didn't answer right away, but she was thinking. That night, she sat at the kitchen table with her father's last 5 journals spread open in front of her and a notepad beside them, and she began to write things down. What the land could support, what markets existed, what she already knew how to grow from years of following her father around this property as a girl, watching and absorbing things she hadn't realized she was absorbing. She pulled up the USDA website on her phone and found the grant program Beryl had mentioned and read through the eligibility requirements 3 times. She was eligible. She applied. The weeks became months. Winter settled over Caldwell County in the particular way of rural Ohio. Not brutal, but insistent, gray and cold and long. Nora worked her shifts at the medical center and came home to the farmhouse and worked on it in the evenings. The repairs were slow but steady. She got the furnace serviced and replaced a section of the kitchen plumbing herself, following instructions from a library book she'd checked out from the county branch and a phone consultation with a plumber in town who appreciated the self-sufficiency and answered her questions honestly. She started cooking real meals. Not because she was happy, she wasn't there yet, but because the house needed the smell of food in it, and because her body needed fuel for what she was asking it to do. And because somewhere in the act of chopping vegetables and setting a pot on the stove, there was a rhythm that felt like being a person again. She began sleeping upstairs, in her old bedroom, which still had the faded purple curtains she'd chosen at 14 and the framed print of the mountains her mother had bought at a garage sale and which had always somehow suggested possibility. It felt, the first night she slept there, like reclaiming something. She didn't think much about Ray. She thought about her children more than she wanted to. Not with anger. She had moved past anger into something cooler and more complicated. She thought about where she had failed them, and she thought about where they had failed her, and she thought about the difference between the two and what could be done about it, if anything. She wrote them both letters that she didn't send. Long ones, honest ones, letters that said things she hadn't been able to say when everything was on fire. She kept them in a folder in the kitchen drawer. Maybe someday. Not yet. Spring came late, but came hard, the way Ohio springs do, exploding from gray to green in the space of a week, the fields going from dormant to riotous almost overnight. Nora was ready. She had gotten the grant. She had bought seeds. She had the barn cleared and organized, and her father's old cultivator serviced by the same mechanic in town who had serviced it for Dale Voss for 20 years. She had talked to Beryl and to the county extension office and to 2 other small producers who would be at the farmer's market and learned everything she could. The first morning, she drove the cultivator down the north field. Alone, the engine loud and satisfying under her hands. The dark soil opening up in neat furrows behind her. She understood something she hadn't been able to articulate through the whole long winter. This was not going back. This was going forward, just from a different starting point than she'd expected. The summer was hard and beautiful and more demanding than anything she had taken on in years. She was growing sweet corn, snap peas, 3 varieties of heirloom tomatoes, basil, and lavender, the lavender on Beryl's advice, because it drew customers to a stall the way nothing else did, and because it dried and sold well through the winter. She also had a small section of sunflowers, not for sale exactly, but because they had been her father's favorite and because she needed to see them. They grew at the edge of the east field in a row that could be seen from the kitchen window, and she had made a habit in July of drinking her morning coffee at the kitchen table while the sun came up behind them, watching them turn their faces east the way they always do. That was just for her. That part was not for sale. The work of the season was unrelenting in the way farming is always unrelenting. The weather didn't care about her schedule, and neither did the weeds, and neither did the pests that arrived in August and required her to make decisions she hadn't anticipated about organic versus conventional and the particular trade-offs involved. She called the extension office twice. She called Beryl twice more. She made decisions and stood behind them. Her hands, by July, were farmers' hands, calloused and capable and permanently carrying a little dirt under the nails no matter how thoroughly she scrubbed them before her hospital shifts. Her co-workers at the medical center had noticed. A few had asked. She had started telling them, briefly, without drama, about the farm, and had been surprised by the quality of their interest. One of the nurses on her unit had asked to come to the market and buy lavender. Another had asked if she sold tomato plants in the spring. People liked to be connected to a place where real food grew. She hadn't expected that to matter to her, but it did. The farmers' market opened the second Saturday in June. Caldwell County had turned out with what felt like genuine enthusiasm. There were 12 stalls the first morning, and by 9 o'clock the parking lot of the old grain elevator where the market was held was nearly full. Nora had driven in with the truck loaded, Beryl following behind in her own vehicle, and they had set up the stall together in the cool morning air with the easy efficiency of people who had done hard work together before. She had a handmade sign, her own lettering, painted on a piece of pine board from the barn, that said Voss Farm, Caldwell County. Under it, smaller, heirloom tomatoes, lavender, seasonal vegetables. She had spent an evening arranging and rearranging the display in her head, and then another evening actually doing it, and was still not sure it was right, but had made herself stop fussing and go to bed. Nora was nervous. She hadn't expected to be. She had talked to hundreds of patients over 30 years. She had managed crises in hospital hallways without blinking. She had handled the destruction of her marriage without publicly falling apart. But standing behind a table of vegetables she had grown herself, waiting for strangers to either value them or not, felt suddenly and unexpectedly vulnerable. It wasn't about money, exactly. It was something harder to name. The exposure of having made something and presented it to the world and asked the world to evaluate it, knowing that this thing you had made was also, in some way, you. The first customer was a young woman with a toddler on her hip who picked up a tomato, smelled it, looked at Nora over it, and said, "Are these actually heirloom? Like actually?" "Brandywine and Cherokee purple," Nora said. "From seeds I started in February. My father grew both varieties on this land for 30 years. The woman bought $6 worth of tomatoes and a bunch of basil and told her friend 2 stalls down, and the friend came back, and by noon Nora's heirloom tomatoes were half gone, and she had spoken to more people she didn't know about things she cared about than she had in any single day of the past 5 years. Something loosened in her chest. Not completely, not all at once, but something. There was a man in his 80s who stood at her stall for a long time looking at the Brandywines without saying anything, and then said, "My mother grew these. I haven't seen them at a market since I was a boy." He bought 2 pounds and paid, without haggling, and walked away slowly, and Nora watched him go and felt the weight of what she was doing. The continuity of it, the way certain things pass through hands and time and land and keep maturing. There was a woman who asked about the lavender, and when Nora explained how she dried it and what it could be used for, stayed for 20 minutes asking questions and ended up buying enough to fill her basket. "I've been trying to find someone local," the woman said. "Everything in the stores comes from overseas. I just wanted something from here, from this ground, from this county, from the 11 acres that Ray's attorney had dismissed as a liability." Beryl watched her from the next stall with the quiet satisfaction of someone who knows when they've made a correct assessment of a person and been proven right. By the end of the market day, Nora had sold out of tomatoes and basil, moved most of the snap peas, and sold enough lavender bundles to fund the next month's seed order. She sat in the truck in the parking lot after loading the empty crates and looked at the cash in the lockbox in her lap. Not a fortune, nothing close, and felt a quality of satisfaction she recognized from nursing but hadn't expected to find in a parking lot with dirt under her fingernails. The satisfaction of having made something, of having put something real into the world. She thought about Marcus and Jolene briefly, then put it aside, not with bitterness, just with the recognition that this part of her life wasn't about them. It was about her. That was a distinction she was only beginning to understand. She drove home on the back roads with the windows down, the evening air coming in warm and sweet off the fields, and she sang along to something on the radio that she only half knew the words to, and she thought, "This is still my life. This is still mine." Before we go deeper, I would love to hear your point of view. Nora had been stripped of nearly everything, and she chose to rebuild on the only ground that was fully hers. Tell me in the comments, if you were in Nora's position, what's the first thing you would have done? The phone call came on a Wednesday in late July, during the kind of afternoon that Ohio delivers in midsummer. Thick and close, with the air barely moving and the sky gone white with haze. Nora was in the barn cleaning and sharpening her father's old hand tools, working systematically down the row of them hanging on the pegboard, when her phone lit up. She didn't recognize the number. Ohio area code, but not one she knew. She almost didn't answer. There had been a period of the divorce when unknown numbers meant attorneys or process servers or calls she hadn't been prepared for, and she had developed a caution around phones that she was still in the process of shedding. She answered. It was Jolene. The sound of her daughter's voice was so unexpected, so suddenly and completely itself. Not a text, not a forwarded message, but Jolene's actual voice, a little rougher than Nora remembered, uncertain at the edges. That Nora sat down on the closest surface, which happened to be a hay bale, and pressed her free hand flat against her knee to keep herself steady. Mom. Jolene. A long pause. Nora didn't fill it. She had learned, in the past year, that her instinct to fill silences, to smooth things over, to make the discomfort go away, had often been the thing that allowed difficult truths to stay unspoken. She was practicing not filling silences. It was harder than it sounded. I wasn't sure you'd pick up. I picked up. Another pause. Outside the barn door, Nora could hear the dry buzz of insects in the heat. The sound of the farm. Her farm. Marcus told me about the grant, Jolene said finally. That you got the USDA thing. For the farm. Nora wondered how Marcus knew that. She hadn't spoken to Marcus since the settlement. She supposed Caldwell County still talked, even across distance. And Marcus had contacts here from summers spent visiting his grandfather as a boy. She filed it away. I did, she said. How's it going? Well, she wasn't going to make this easy. Not from cruelty, but because she didn't know what this was yet, and she wasn't going to perform emotion for someone who had sent her a birthday text that said, "Hope you're figuring things out." She needed to know what Jolene was actually calling to say. Mom. Jolene's voice changed slightly. Younger. More uncertain. The voice she'd had at about 15, before she'd learned to smooth it into something more controlled. The voice she'd had the night she called Nora from a college dorm at 2 in the morning because something had gone wrong with a friend and she didn't know what to do. Nora had talked her through it then. She remembered the relief in Jolene's voice when she heard her mother's voice. The way it settled something just to be heard. I don't know how to start. Start from wherever is true, Nora said. That's usually the easiest place. A silence. The kind that has weight in it. The kind that precedes something real. Then, I was wrong. About how I handled things. About the way I let it happen. Nora closed her eyes. Outside, the insects hummed on. The barn smelled of old wood and oil and the dry sweetness of hay. Her father's tools hung on the wall, tidy and waiting. I don't want you to forgive me right now, Jolene said. I'm not calling for that. I know that would take time if it happened at all. I needed to say it. That I was wrong. And that I know what you built for us. What you gave up to build it. And I needed you to know that I know. Nora opened her eyes. She looked at the wall of tools her father had kept immaculate for 40 years. Still there, still useful. I hear you, she said. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. But it wasn't a door closed permanently, either. And she thought her father would have said that was the honest answer. "Where are you?" Jolene asked. "In the barn," Nora said. "Your grandfather's barn." A small sound from Jolene, something that might have been a sob, quickly controlled. Jolene had always been fierce about not crying in front of people. Even her mother. Especially her mother. Does it look the same? Nora looked around at the old wood beams, the dusty light coming through the gaps in the siding, the ordered row of tools. The way her father's presence was still woven into the arrangement of things, the logic of where each tool hung, the systems he'd built that still worked. "It looks like him," she said. Jolene was quiet for a moment. "I used to love it there," she said, and her voice was genuinely younger when she said it. "I know I never said that. I think I thought it was embarrassing to love a farm when I was a teenager. But I used to love it." "I know," Nora said. "Did you?" "A mother knows." They talked for 40 minutes. Not about the past, mostly. About the farm, what she was growing, how the market was going, what she was learning. Jolene asked questions and listened to the answers, and the quality of her listening was real, not polite. She asked about the lavender, whether it was hard to grow, whether it came back every year, and about the journals, and about Beryl Dunmore, whom she vaguely remembered from childhood visits as a woman with a loud laugh and strong opinions about weather. "She still has the loud laugh," Nora said, "and stronger opinions than ever." Jolene laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her. And for a moment, Nora could hear the girl she'd raised inside the woman her daughter had become, and it was both painful and good to hear. By the end, something had shifted, not resolved, not healed, but moved from one position to another in a way that felt like the beginning of a process. The kind of process that would take years and require honesty from both of them, and would not always feel like progress even when it was. After they hung up, Nora sat on the hay bale for a while longer. She thought about what she had wanted to say and hadn't. What she would say next time, if there was a next time. What the right pace for this was. Then she went back to sharpening the tools. Harvest came in waves the way it always does. Not all at once, but in overlapping rushes, this crop peaking while another was still building, and the work of it was constant and physical and more satisfying than Nora had words for. The lavender had done especially well. Beryl had been right about that. The bundles sold out every market Saturday before 10 in the morning, and Nora had started taking orders from a florist in the county seat and from an artisan soap maker who drove down from Columbus once a month to buy in bulk. The heirloom tomatoes had developed a following. She heard from multiple customers that people were specifically driving out from the county seat on Saturday mornings because of them. She had a waiting list for Cherokee purples. A waiting list. For tomatoes she had grown with her own hands on her father's land. She found that extremely funny in the best possible way. She called Beryl to tell her about the waiting list, and Beryl laughed the loud laugh that Jolene had remembered from childhood and said, "Your father would have loved that. He always knew those tomatoes were something special. Never did figure out how to market them. He never tried," Nora said. "No," Beryl agreed. "He grew them because he loved growing them. That was enough for him." Nora thought about that for days afterward. The difference between her father's relationship with this land and what she was building. He had grown things for the love of growing them, for the private satisfaction of good soil and good work and the yield of seasons faithfully attended to. She was doing that too. But she was also building something that could sustain her, something with a future that didn't depend on anyone else's goodwill or generosity or continued presence in her life. She wondered if her father would have approved of that distinction, or if it would have seemed, to him, like a complication of something that was most beautiful when it was simple. She thought he would have approved. He was a practical man. He believed in sustaining yourself. She began to think about the following year. More lavender. A greenhouse for wintergreens. She'd been talking to a beekeeper 2 counties over who was looking for someone to host hives. The bees would help her crops, and she'd get a share of the honey to sell. Beryl had mentioned a regional food co-op that was looking for reliable small producers to anchor their fall and winter catalog. Things were growing, and not just in the literal sense. She was sleeping well. She was cooking real food. She had repainted the kitchen. Not the yellow tile, which she'd decided to keep because it was her mother's and had become hers. But the walls, a warm cream color that caught the morning light and held it. She had replaced the front porch light. She had fixed the shutter and cleaned the gutters and spent a full weekend on the barn roof with a bucket of sealant and no company but the radio and a thermos of iced coffee. And when she came down on Sunday evening, she was sunburned and exhausted and deeply, genuinely satisfied. She put flowers from the garden in a jar on the kitchen table. She hung a bird feeder on the porch post her father had always hung one on. The same birds came. She was not being fanciful when she thought this. She knew there was no way to know if any of these chickadees or house finches were descended from the specific birds her father had fed. The math of bird generations didn't work that way. But they came to the feeder in the same casual, deliberate way birds had always come to this porch, as if the feeder had always been there, as if this had always been a place that kept that particular promise. She watched them from the kitchen window in the mornings and found the watching meditative in a way that nothing she'd sought out for that purpose had ever been. Small things. The kind of things that mean a life is being lived, not just maintained. In September, she got a letter from Ray's attorney. She stood at the mailbox at the end of the lane and opened it and read it twice. Ray's attorney was informing her, on behalf of his client, that there had been an oversight in the settlement documentation. Specifically, a retirement fund that had been improperly excluded from the asset division. Her attorney had been notified. There would be additional proceedings. Nora folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. She walked back up the lane to the house. She noticed, walking up the lane, the way the light was falling across the north field in the late afternoon September way, long and gold, the kind of light that makes ordinary things look significant. The corn stalks had been harvested, but the rows were still visible in the soil, and in the far corner the sunflowers had gone fully to seed, their heavy heads bowed, and she had been leaving them for the birds. She called her attorney. They talked for an hour. By the end of the conversation, it was clear that the oversight was significant, enough to substantially change the picture. Not a windfall, her attorney cautioned, but meaningful. Enough to make a difference to what the farm could become. Nora thanked her attorney and hung up. She went out to the garden and pulled the last of the fall tomatoes from the vine, the brandywines still deep and heavy with warmth even this late in the season, and set them the colander on the kitchen counter, and she stood there for a moment looking at them. All those months ago, when she had stood in her father's dark kitchen with her duffel bag on the floor and a glass of rusty water in her hand, she could not have predicted this moment. She had not believed, then, that there was a version of the future that felt like this. That felt like standing in a kitchen that was hers, in a house she had rebuilt with her own hands, holding tomatoes she had grown from seeds she had started herself from soil her father had spent 40 years enriching. She had not believed it then, but here it was. Winter came, and Nora let it come. She had prepared for it the way her father had always prepared. Firewood stacked on the north side of the house, the furnace serviced, the pipes insulated, the root cellar filled with the things she had put up over the fall. Canned tomatoes in rows on the basement shelves. Dried lavender hanging in the barn, filling the space with its clean, steady scent. Jars of honey from the first season of the bees she'd agreed to host, amber and thick, labeled in her own handwriting. She gave some of those jars as gifts at Christmas. To Beryl, to the woman from the extension office, to the mechanic in town, to the nurses on her unit at the medical center. She had not given gifts from this kind of abundance in a long time. The abundance of having made something with her hands that was worth giving. It was a different feeling from buying a gift card. She hadn't expected it to be so different, but it was. There were letters from both Marcus and Jolene now, sitting in the kitchen drawer beside the unsent one she had written to them. Marcus had written in November, a short letter, careful and a little stiff, the letter of a person who is not accustomed to saying things directly, but is making an effort. He acknowledged things. Not everything, not yet. He said he had driven through Caldwell County on a work trip and had thought about stopping and hadn't felt like he had the right yet. But he had thought about it. She had written back to both of them. Brief letters, not warm exactly, not cold. Honest. The kind of correspondence between people who have hurt each other and are trying to find out if there's still ground to stand on together. It was enough. It was for now enough. The co-op agreement had come through in October. Beryl had helped her put together the paperwork and driven to the meeting with her and sat in the back of the room while Nora presented her operation to the co-op selection board. Nora had been calm and precise and knew her numbers and her land in a way that left no doubt she was serious. The board voted to include her in the winter catalog. She spent the quiet winter months planning the greenhouse she'd been thinking about. She got 3 quotes and chose the middle one from a local fabricator who had built one for another producer in the county and whose work Beryl had personally inspected. Ground would break in March. A new section of fence along the east field. A meeting with the county extension office about a possible partnership for a community-supported agriculture box program the following summer. The CSA idea had come from a conversation in the farmer's market in August. A family that had stopped at her stall and mentioned they drove 40 minutes each way to subscribe to a box service in another county and wished there was something local. Nora had taken down their name. She'd gone home and looked at the model and thought about what it would require and realized she could do it if she was willing to expand the operation carefully and find 2 or 3 other small producers willing to share the commitment. Beryl had agreed immediately. A third producer, a younger woman named Sasha Tillman, who had recently taken over her in-laws' property 2 miles east, had come to the farmer's market late in the season, heard about what Nora was building, and asked to be involved. 3 women, 3 farms, Caldwell County. She was building something, not rebuilding. She was clear about the distinction. She wasn't trying to reconstruct what had existed before. The house in Dayton, the life with Ray, the version of herself that had organized around other people's needs and definitions. That was gone. She was not sorry it was gone anymore. She was building something new on the ground that had always been hers, with the skills she had always had, in a direction she was choosing herself. She called Beryl on New Year's Eve because it seemed right, and they talked for an hour about nothing important. The weather, a book Beryl was reading, a raccoon that had gotten into the co-op barn and caused a significant disruption. And at midnight, they both stepped out onto their respective porches and watched the distant fireworks over the county seat and called Happy New Year across the dark field between their properties. Nora stood on her father's porch in the cold. The stars were very clear. She could hear the distant boom and color of the fireworks and the closer, quieter sounds of the farm at rest. The settling of the barn, the bare branches of the old oak tree moving in the wind. The same sound her father had heard standing on this porch for 40 years. The same stars, the same cold, the same dark field, the same sky. She thought about him, about the journals and the cedar chest upstairs. All those years of paying attention to what this land could do and what the weather was saying and what it meant to be a person who showed up day after day for the things that needed doing. She thought about what he had written when she was 14. Asterisk Nora has her mother's heart. She doesn't know yet how much that matters. Someday she will, asterisk. She thought she understood it now. Not because she had survived the worst year of her adult life. Not because she had rebuilt the house, or grown the tomatoes, or gotten the grant, or had the conversations with her children that needed having. But because she had done all of it the way her father had always done things on this land. With her hands. With attention. With the willingness to stay. She went back inside. She put the kettle on. She sat at the kitchen table in the warm yellow light and opened her father's most recent journal to the first blank page, a page he had never written on, and she picked up his pen, which she had found in the cedar chest and kept on the table, and she wrote the date at the top. Then she began. There was one more thing about the barn. Nora had been working her way through it for months, organizing, cleaning, deciding what to keep and what to let go, and had gotten to the very back corner, behind the old equipment and the stacked lumber and the shelves of paint cans and seed boxes, where her father had built a small workbench against the south wall. She had been saving that corner. She wasn't sure exactly why. She could rationalize it in practical terms. The workbench was the lowest priority. The equipment had to come first. The lumber needed to be inventory before she could know what she had. But the honest answer was that there was something about that corner that felt like the last room in a house she wasn't ready to enter. Like the final page of a book you've been reading slowly because you're not ready for it to be over. Her father had done his woodworking in that corner. She remembered it from childhood. The smell of sawdust and linseed oil, the sound of the hand plane moving with the grain, the way he would stop and hold a piece of wood up to the light to look at it, turning it slowly, looking for something she couldn't see at 8 or 10 or 12 years old, but that clearly mattered to him. He had made things in that corner. Small things, mostly. A step stool for the kitchen. A frame for a mirror. Once, a cradle that had eventually gone to a cousin's family. He had not been a professional woodworker or anything close to it. He was a farmer who also made things with his hands, because making things with your hands was part of how he understood himself in the world. When she finally got to it, on a Saturday afternoon in late February while the thin winter sun came through the south-facing window and lit up the dust in the air, gold light, the kind that makes everything it touches look briefly precious, she found what she had half known she would find. Her father's woodworking tools, carefully maintained, oiled, and wrapped in cloth, arranged in the order a man arranges things when he expects to come back to them. A set of chisels in graduated sizes, each one wrapped in a square of oilcloth and placed in a tray her father had built for exactly that purpose. A hand plane, the iron still sharp. Several mallets of different weights. His carving knives folded in a leather roll that she unrolled carefully on the workbench surface. The blades still sharp, each one honed and clean, the leather stiff from years of disuse but intact. She opened the roll slowly, the way you'd open something given to you carefully, and looked at each blade in the pale February light. He had kept them ready. That was what undid her, slightly, before she found the box. Not the tools themselves, but the readiness of them. The oilcloth, the careful wrapping, the tray built to hold them in order. A man who maintained his tools that way believed he was going to use them again. He had kept them ready for a return that didn't come. She stood at the workbench for a moment and breathed. Then she saw the shelf, low, built into the wall, just below the workbench surface, partially hidden by the angle of the bench itself. She had nearly missed it in the dim light of her earlier visits to the barn. But in the direct south window light of this afternoon, the edge of a wooden box caught the beam and held it. She lifted it down carefully. It was about the size of a shoebox, made from cherry wood that her father had planed and joined himself. Clearly, she could see the marks of his hand in it, the deliberate care of the joinery, the way the corners were fitted together with a precision that spoke of patience. The cherry wood had darkened slightly with age and had the warm glow that cherry always develops, the color of old sunlight. The lid fit precisely. She had to press slightly at the corners to release it. She pressed. It opened. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed slightly but held, was a birdhouse. A finished one, painted a weathered red that matched the barn. Carved details around the entry hole. Flowers, she thought at first, then looked closer and saw they were the same sunflowers he grew in the east field every summer. Sunflowers carved into wood, each petal cut with the careful deliberation of someone who was making something for keeps. Someone who was not hurrying. Someone who had time and was choosing to spend it this way. She turned it over in her hands. The workmanship was careful throughout, not showy, not technically spectacular in a way that required admiration, but sound. Built to last outdoors. Built to hold. On the bottom of the birdhouse, in her father's handwriting in small, careful letters, for Nora girl. When you come back to the place you started. She sat down on the workbench stool and held the birdhouse in her lap and did not try to stop what happened next. He had known, not how or when, but he had known, in the way that parents sometimes know things about their children that the children don't know about themselves yet, that she would need this place someday, that she would come back, that the land he had spent his life on would matter to her in a way that couldn't be planned, only arrived at. He had known it, and he had made something to mark it, and he had put it in a box in the back corner of the barn and left it there, waiting the way the land itself had been waiting, not dormant exactly, but patient, ready for the right hands. She sat there for a long time. She thought about her father making this. When had he made it? She couldn't know. The tissue paper suggested it had been there for years. It might have been in the last years of his life, when his own health was declining and he was thinking about endings and continuities. Or it might have been earlier, some Saturday afternoon, when he'd simply had the impulse to make something for her and had acted on it without overthinking. Either way, he had thought of her, had sat in this corner with his tools and thought of his daughter and made her something to come home to. She cried for a while. The real kind, not the controlled kind she'd become accustomed to. Not the kind she did alone in her car in the hospital parking lot on hard nights. Or the kind she did quietly into a dish towel when something unexpected caught her off guard. The kind that comes from the deepest place, from the very center of grief and love, and the understanding that some people love you in ways you only fully comprehend after they're gone. Then she wiped her face. She carried the birdhouse to the front porch and hung it on the post by the door, where the morning light would catch it and the sunflowers carved into the wood would face the east field, toward the sunflowers she had planted there herself, the ones she'd put in because they were his favorite and because she needed to see them. She stepped back and looked at it. Small, bright, exactly right. Before we go deeper into this final chapter, I want to hear from you directly. Nora was stripped of almost everything, and then, in the most unexpected place, she found the most meaningful gift of all. If someone in your life left you something like that, a note, a gift, a waiting kindness, tell me about it in the comments. Those are the stories I live for. The following years were not perfect. The greenhouse had a cold snap in its first March that damaged a section of seedlings and set her spring schedule back by 3 weeks. There was a summer with too little rain and another with too much, and both took their toll on the tomatoes. The additional retirement funds from the settlement proceedings came through more slowly than she'd hoped, and there were months where the farm income and the nursing income together were tighter than she wanted. Marcus visited once in the second summer. A brief visit, cautious on both sides, but real. He helped her clear a section of fence line without being asked, and they ate dinner at the kitchen table without talking about the past, and watched a storm coming over the north field from the porch, and he said, before he left, that he was sorry. Not at length, but he said it directly and looked at her when he said it. She told him she heard him. Jolene came the following spring and stayed a week and helped her plant the expanded lavender section and learned to drive the cultivator and spent an afternoon in the barn going through the old journals with her and cried over the same entry Nora had cried over. Something shifted between them that week in the way that week-long shared work shifts things. Not to the past, but toward something new. Nora turned 62 the summer the greenhouse produced its first full winter harvest. Beryl brought a cake from the bakery in town, and the woman from the extension office came, and 2 other women from the co-op, and they sat on the porch in the warm evening and ate cake and talked about soil and weather and markets and the particular satisfaction of work you believe in. She reduced her nursing hours. Not to stop. She wouldn't stop entirely. It was too much of who she was, the tending of people, the usefulness of her hands in that specific way. But to less. 3 days a week. The rest of her time, the land. The farm had a name by then. Not an official name, not on a sign or a registration, but a name that people used when they talked about it, Voss Farm. The same name it had always had. The name her father had given it just by working it for 40 years. Hers now, carrying forward. She kept the journals. She kept writing in the one she'd started on New Year's Eve. Not every day, but often. Weather observations. Soil notes. The small daily record of what the land was doing and what she was doing in response to it. Her father's voice continued. And on the shelf in the kitchen, in a ceramic pot her mother had made in a community pottery class in 1991, slightly lopsided, deeply personal, there was a photograph she had put there in the second year. A photograph she had found in the cedar chest, tucked inside the pages of one of the journals. Her father, standing in the north field. Young in it, late 30s she guessed, maybe younger, with his cap on and his hands at his sides, squinting into the sun, smiling slightly, the kind of smile that means a person is where they belong. Behind him, the farmhouse. Behind the farmhouse, the sky. All of it's still there. All of it's still hers. Before we close this out, I want to ask you something, and I genuinely mean this. Nora's children took almost everything. Her son, her daughter, the man she gave 30 years to. But they forgot the farm. They forgot the 11 acres and the old house with good bones and the barn full of her father's tools. They forgot the ground that was already hers before any of them entered her life. Have you ever had someone underestimate what you had left? Have you ever watched someone dismiss the very thing that ended up saving you? Leave your thoughts below. I read every single comment, And stories like this remind me that what looks like nothing to other people can be everything to the right person. The thing about the farm was this. It had never been about money. Not in the way that Ray's attorney had dismissed it, a liability, marginal value, not worth the fight. That was a way of valuing something that only counted certain things. Liquid value, market appraisal, return on investment. But the farm was not that kind of value. The farm was 40 years of her father's attention. The soil he had composted and tested and tended until it was richer than most of what surrounded it. The tools he had maintained so carefully that they were still sharp and true decades after his hands had last touched them. The journals, 20 years of a man paying close, faithful attention to the world he inhabited, writing it down so it wouldn't be lost, so it could be found. The farm was the birdhouse wrapped in tissue paper in a cherry wood box on a shelf in the back corner of the barn. Waiting. When they took the house in Dayton, they took the thing they could appraise. They took the things with obvious value, the things you could put a number on. They took the car and the accounts and the investments and the 30 years of a life structured around their needs and definitions. But they forgot the ground. They forgot that some inheritance is not financial, that some things can only be passed down through presence, through the slow accumulation of days spent paying attention in the same place, through the willingness to stay in one ground long enough that it knows you. They forgot that Nora Voss had spent her whole childhood on those 11 acres, that she had absorbed something there that no settlement agreement could touch, that she knew the way the north field drained after heavy rain and the exact spot where the deer crossed the fence line in November, and the way the light came through the barn door in February and made the dust look like something holy. They forgot that her father had built things to last, and that includes her. A Tuesday evening in October. The air has just enough cold in it to make you want a jacket. The leaves on the old oak tree have gone gold and are just beginning to let go, spiraling down to the dark grass. Nora comes up the porch steps with a basket of late-season tomatoes on her arm. She pauses at the top of the steps and looks at the birdhouse her father made for her, the one that waited in the barn all those years, and the carved sunflowers facing east toward the field where her own sunflowers stood all summer and are now gone to seed. She goes inside. The kitchen light comes on, warm yellow, filling the window, spilling out onto the porch, out into the dark that is just beginning to come down over the fields. From the road, if someone drives past, they see it, a farmhouse with a light in the window. And if they know the story, if they are one of the women from the co-op or Beryl Dunmore coming back from town, or someone who's driven past this lane for years and watched it go from dark to lit, they understand what that light means. It means the land is being worked. It means someone came back. It means that what looked like nothing turned out to be everything. It means that some people, when they have been stripped to the ground, discover that the ground itself was always enough. The light stays on. It stays on through the long Ohio winters and the short, explosive springs. It stays on through the hard seasons and the good ones. Through the years when the weather is cooperative and the years when it is not. Through the slow rebuilding of something between a mother and her children. Not what it was before, but something more honest, something that knows its own weight. It stays on because Nora Voss keeps it on. Not for anyone else. Not to signal anything to the road. Just because a house with a light in the window is a house that is being lived in, and living in it is what she has chosen to do. And that brings us to the end of Nora's story. If this story moved you, if there was a moment that hit differently, a line that stayed with you, something in Nora's journey that reminded you of someone you love or a version of yourself you recognize, I want to hear about it. Drop it in the comments. Tell me what part landed hardest. Was it the moment she found the birdhouse? The phone call from Jolene? The realization that what they dismissed as worthless was the only thing that truly mattered? If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and join us at Orvin Stories. We tell stories about real human strength, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't announce itself but changes everything. Like this video, if Nora's story deserved to be told. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. I read every comment, every one, and I'll see you in the next story. Until then, remember, they can take a lot from you, but they can't take the ground you were built on.